At 04:20 hours local time, 44 Ukrainian UJ-26 Beaver UAVs took off simultaneously from a secret launch site in Kharkiv, racing straight toward a railway bridge in Luhansk, an area under Russian occupation. This was an extremely important link in the railway logistics network that transported fuel, weapons, and ammunition connecting the occupied regions of Luhansk and Donetsk to support the battlefield in the east. Ukraine had prepared this operation for 2 months with an almost absolute level of secrecy. The flight paths of the Beavers were calculated to follow low terrain and slip through radar gaps Ukrainian reconnaissance had identified in advance. But in just a few seconds, the entire situation could change. What the Ukrainian commander did not know was that after the attacks on vital routes and supply convoys heading to Crimea, Russia had quietly reinforced key logistics points with Pantsir, Tor, and Vidyaz systems. However, the first threat the Beaver swarm had to overcome was not missiles, but the NEBO-M long-range surveillance radar. This is a multi-band radar system capable of detecting targets from great distances, including low-flying UAVs, or targets with small radar reflections. NEBO-M's VHF channel can detect targets much earlier than many conventional radars. But its weakness is that its tracking accuracy is not enough to create a perfect firing solution on its own. It has to coordinate with other fire control radars inside the air defense network, and that was exactly the gap Ukraine was trying to exploit. By 04:24 hours local time, the lead Beavers began lowering their altitude, hugging the approach corridor that had been reconnoitered in advance. Their optical sensors shifted into the final phase of the mission. They only needed to correctly identify the shape of the bridge, the railway tracks, the support pillars, and the connection area with the main transport route. If NEBO-M was suppressed, jammed, or forced to stay silent for only a few minutes, this attack would no longer be an ordinary raid. It would become a direct strike against Russia's ability to supply the entire Eastern Front. Behind NEBO-M's early warning layer, the next target the Beaver swarm had to face was the modern air defense net directly protecting the railway bridge in Luhansk. What made the situation even more dangerous for Ukraine was that Russia had quietly added the S-350 Vityaz monster around key logistics points along the reinforcement route. The S-350 was designed to seal dangerous gaps at medium and low altitude. Its 50N6A multifunction radar is responsible for detection, tracking, target assignment, and missile guidance for the 9M96 interceptors. In theory, this is a very dangerous system against drones, cruise missiles, and low-flying targets trying to slip into a protected area. But in reality, the Beavers did not rush in the way the S-350 wanted them to. Ukrainian operators forced the entire formation down to an altitude of 250 feet, hugging the ground and following the approach corridor that had been calculated in advance. At that altitude, the radar horizon began to become an ally of the attacker. Even though the 50N6A radar can track targets more accurately than NEBO-M, its real detection range against small UAVs flying extremely low is still significantly shortened by terrain, buildings, trees, and ground clutter. By 04:26 hours local time, when the lead Beavers had already passed through most of the most dangerous approach zone, Russia's reaction window began shrinking very quickly. From this moment on, any delay in transferring data from the early warning radar to the fire control radar could compress the entire interception network down to only minutes, even tens of seconds. And it was in that moment that the Beaver's ultra-low altitude flight technique began to show its greatest value. Even the S-350 crew no longer had much time to clearly see the threat racing in. The 50N6A radar is very powerful in tracking clear targets against a clean sky, where the reflected signal is separated from the surrounding environment. But against small Beavers flying low close to the ground, that advantage was sharply reduced. The radar signal could be mixed with reflections from terrain, railway tracks, stations, power poles, buildings, and metal objects around the bridge area. By the time the Beavers closed in on the defensive zone, the distance was less than 2 miles. This was an extremely unfavorable range for the S-350. Although Vityaz was built to intercept low-flying targets and react much faster than many long-range systems, it still needed time to confirm the target, classify the flight path, issue the firing order, and guide the missile to the interception point. In a raid at such close range, every processing step was squeezed into an extremely short window. At that moment, the S-350 was like a very powerful system pulled into a fight where the reaction space had been narrowed to a dangerous level. Even Panzer S-1, the short-range air defense layer protecting the outer ring, no longer had much chance to rescue the situation. From detection to firing, this system still had to pass through an entire sequence of actions: target confirmation, data processing, target lock, weapon rotation, and missile launch. But in that brief stretch of time, the Beavers, flying at 100 miles per hour, continued closing the distance very quickly. If they were only detected at a distance of 1 mile, Panzer S-1's real reaction window was almost reduced to just a few seconds. And when that moment came, everything had already moved beyond control. At 04:28 hours local time, the first Beavers raced straight into the air defense area, protecting the bridge, aiming at the radars and interception positions around it. As the main defensive layer fell into disorder, the remaining aircraft continued punching through the gap that had just opened, racing toward the railway bridge. Within minutes, the area around the railway line fell into chaos. Air defense fire poured upward, radar signals were split and scattered, and the surviving Beavers continued driving toward the main target. The strike was no longer aimed only at a bridge. It was aimed directly at Russia's ability to move fuel, weapons, and ammunition from Luhansk into Donetsk, where Moscow was trying to maintain pressure across the entire eastern battlefield. And that was only the opening phase of the series of strikes Ukraine launched that morning. By 04:30 hours local time, while smoke was still rising from the air defense system protecting the bridge that had just been hit, the next Ukrainian drone wave continued closing in on the railway bridge in Luhansk. The early morning here was covered in thick fog, compressing visibility to a very short distance and making the entire area look as if it had sunk into a pale white curtain. Russian defenses had now entered a high alert state. Panzer S-1 systems were activated, and the combat crews stared tensely at their radar screens, ready to stop the next attack wave. But what they had not yet realized was that this dense fog was unintentionally giving Ukraine another advantage. The first abnormal signal immediately appeared on the screen. It was the same target, but the signal became unstable, sometimes clear, sometimes faint, as if it were constantly changing position inside the chaotic clutter. At one moment, the signal shifted to the right, then it drifted left. 1 second, it appeared at an altitude of 400 feet. The next, it jumped to 2,000 feet. In reality, it was still only one Beaver flying low through the fog, but the high humidity and limited visibility made detection, identification, and target lock much more difficult. For the Panzer S-1 combat crew, that meant every second of reaction time became precious. A delay of only a few seconds could allow the target to slip deeper into the defensive zone around the bridge. And that brief window of confusion continued to open another opportunity for Ukraine's attack. Another problem quickly emerged on the Russian defensive side. The short-range surveillance radar supporting the area around the bridge, originally designed to track targets under more favorable conditions, began losing effectiveness when a sudden heavy rainstorm swept over Luhansk. Thick sheets of rain cut across the defensive zone, making the observation background more chaotic, while the signals of small, low-flying targets began flickering amid interference from the ground, the railway tracks, the bridge pillars, and the surrounding structures. With the Beavers flying low through the rain, accurately detecting them became far more difficult. But the biggest obstacle appeared when the Panzer S-1 systems entered the interception phase. With visibility squeezed shut and target signals unstable, the Russian combat crews needed an extra 2 seconds to confirm, lock, and then fire. Meanwhile, Ukraine's UJ-26 Beavers adapted very quickly to these weather conditions. They were designed to maintain stable flight in bad weather with limited dependence on complex control inputs in the final phase. Because of that, the formation continued holding its approach rhythm as it cut through the heavy rain. Sensors on the lead aircraft began correcting the flight path following the shape of the bridge, the railway tracks, the support pillars, and the connection area with the main transport route. Finally, one Panzer S-1 system managed to lock onto the target and open fire. 857 E-6 missiles left the launchers one after another, accelerated to Mach 3.8, and raced straight toward the approaching Beaver formation. Streaks of fire tore through the rain, and within seconds the proximity fuses activated. 8 Ukrainian UAVs were shot down on the approach, but that interception still was not enough to close the attack. When the range became too short for optimal missile use, Panzer S-1 switched to cannon fire. 230 mm's 2A38M automatic cannons swung sharply and poured dense bursts of fire toward the remaining UAVs. A red-hot curtain of bullets ripped across the air, shooting down 4 more Beavers just before the final defensive zone. But the remaining 6 had broken through. They raced straight into the railway bridge in Luhansk. A series of explosions struck the bridge deck, the tracks, and critical load-bearing points. A 120 lb per square inch shockwave threw metal fragments, concrete, and ballast stone into the air. One section of the railway line was torn open, while black smoke began rolling upward through the heavy rain. By around 04:34 hours local time, the area around the bridge had fallen into chaos. Russian defenses had launched 8 interceptors, fired heavy bursts of 30 mm cannon rounds, and brought down 12 UAVs during the direct approach. But the remaining 6 Beavers still pierced through the air defense net and hit the target, leaving the critical railway bridge in Luhansk badly damaged. But Ukraine's attack plan had not stopped yet. Behind them, the final 14 Beavers of the strike wave received new information. A Russian train carrying weapons and ammunition had just passed through the area and was continuing forward to reinforce the front line. If that train reached its destination, its cargo would immediately be transferred into the hands of Russian units fighting in the east. And at that very moment, the mission changed. The final Beavers began accelerating to their maximum speed of 120 miles per hour, leaving the original approach route and following the railway line, now drowning in heavy rain. After cutting the reinforcement route, Ukraine decided to stop that train before it could deliver weapons, ammunition, and supplies to Russian forces at the front. Ukraine was about to show you that the success of the previous strike did not depend only on luck. The real advantage lay in how the attack was organized to break the very operating logic of Russia's defensive system. And the next attack wave unfolded exactly that way. By 04:36 hours local time, after the railway bridge in Luhansk had already been hit, the final 24 Beavers continued following the railway line through the heavy rain. Their new target was the Russian train carrying weapons and ammunition that had just passed through the area and was still moving toward the eastern front line. By this point, Russia had exposed almost every defensive layer around this critical logistics route. S-350 Vityaz formed the medium-range interception layer. Tor and Panzer S-1 systems handled close-range protection, ready to deal with small, low-flying targets that appeared suddenly. Meanwhile, electronic warfare systems were deployed to jam navigation and communication channels across the approach area. In theory, this was a defensive network dense enough to turn any drone attack into a costly war of attrition. But then, 24 UJ-26 Beavers appeared on the screen, and from that moment, the weakness of the entire network began to show. They did not rush in from one single direction. They split into 5 small groups, approaching from different angles with different altitudes and different rhythms. This was a pre-calculated attack style designed to overload the defensive system. When many small targets appear at the same time on multiple approach axes, radar, command posts, and interception systems are forced to constantly change target priority, switch tracking direction, and divide their firepower. The first group flew low along the railway line, forcing nearby radars to focus on the direct approach axis. The second group shifted to the flank, pulling Panzer S-1 fire away from the main direction. The third group stayed farther behind, adding pressure to the target classification process. The remaining 2 groups continued circling along the terrain, waiting for the moment when the air defense net was stretched thin. Within only 30 seconds, the very network designed to coordinate tightly began to be compressed to its limit. Russia's problem was that theoretical capability did not equal real battlefield effectiveness. The S-350 could track multiple targets within a radius of 150 miles. Panzer LS-1 was flexible, able to use both missiles and cannon fire to rapidly intercept targets at any range, whether far or near. But when the 5 Beaver groups used swarm tactics, constantly changing formation, sometimes spreading wide, sometimes compressing together, the entire defensive system was forced to continuously recalculate tracking data, priority directions, and firing solutions. By the time the S-350 radar operator detected 24 signals racing toward the train, the data was immediately transferred back to the command control room. The order to activate the Pol-21 electronic warfare system was issued right afterward. This system specializes in jamming satellite navigation signals and was deployed to cover the reinforcement route area, aiming to throw off the flight paths of UAVs that depended on GPS. The effect appeared almost immediately. The lead Beaver group began losing GPS signals, and the formation drifted diagonally to the right away from the railway line. On the control screen, their flight direction was no longer as stable as before. After only 1 minute, the distance between the Beaver swarm and the train had shrunk to around 10 miles, while the train itself was still continuing toward the front line. The Ukrainian operators immediately switched to autonomous mode. The Beavers used inertial navigation combined with structure recognition and railway tracking to continue chasing the target. They no longer depended entirely on external guidance signals. Instead, they followed the shape of the rails, power poles, small stations, railway curves, and the train's direction of movement to self-correct their flight path. But another problem immediately appeared. The train was still moving. Against a continuously moving target, the probability of a direct hit became much lower. A delay of only a few seconds during the dive could cause a UAV to crash into the empty space behind a train car or detonate too early beside the tracks without causing enough damage to stop the train. So, Ukraine changed the approach. One Beaver group decided to accelerate, moving ahead of the train instead of continuing to fly directly at it. Their target was no longer the moving cargo cars, but the section of railway ahead. If the train could not be hit while it was moving, then its route would be cut off first. The Beavers in this group lowered their altitude, hugged the rail line, and raced toward the blocking point. The sensor on the lead aircraft locked onto a section of track ahead of the locomotive, 2 parallel steel rails, the ballast layer underneath, and the connection area where the rail bed rose slightly above the ground. Only seconds later, the first Beaver pitched down. The explosion struck one side of the rail directly, bending the steel away from its support. The shockwave tore through the ballast layer, throwing stone, soil, and metal fragments along the railway line. The second aircraft slammed in right beside the impact point, widening the destroyed area and knocking the sleepers underneath out of position. In an instant, the section of track ahead of the train was no longer a continuous route. One rail was bent and warped, the other had shifted off its axis, and the rail bed had been torn open into a dangerous break. Vibrations traveled back along the rails and from inside the locomotive cabin. The Russian crew realized that the route ahead had been destroyed. They were forced to apply the emergency brake. Steel wheels ground against the rails in a long, piercing screech, while the entire heavy train lurched forward as the sudden braking force pressed through every cargo car behind it. The speed began dropping rapidly, but that very moment turned the train from a difficult moving target into a heavy, slow, and almost trapped mass, sitting directly on the reinforcement route. At a range of less than 0.5 miles, the video signal from the Beavers began breaking apart badly. On the control screen, only patches of white static remain, along with the shadows of the railway tracks, the flames from the locomotive and cargo cars appearing and disappearing. The jamming system on the Russian train was pressing hard against the video transmission channel, forcing the Ukrainian control crew to fly almost entirely by inertial data. The rail line map and the target position sent back by Group Number 1 before it struck the track. Below, the train had just been forced into an emergency stop after the track section ahead was damaged. The cargo cars slammed their weight toward the locomotive, the steel wheels grinding in a long, piercing screech while the entire body of the train shook violently under the sudden braking force. Russians' escort soldiers immediately jumped out on both sides of the road, looking for cover while firing AK-12s back into the sky. But against UAVs diving at 120 miles per hour, the window to aim and shoot had been reduced to only a few seconds. The first Beaver group struck the locomotive. The lead aircraft pitched down into the power compartment where the engine cluster, fuel lines, electrical system, and main control panel were concentrated. The roughly 50 lb warhead detonated against the steel skin. The pressure at the impact point exceeded 100 pounds per square inches, enough to tear open thin armor panels, sever electrical cables, and destroy the fuel lines. A burst of fire erupted from the nose of the train. The locomotive did not only lose traction, it became a heavy obstacle locking the entire train in place on the reinforcement route. Immediately afterward, the second group dived into the third car. This was a car carrying flammable fuel. When the penetrating warhead detonated, hot fragments and blast pressure ripped open the body of the car, driving heat into the storage compartment inside. Fuel vapor ignited almost instantly. An orange-red column of fire blasted out from both sides of the car, spilled down onto the ballast, and spread along the rails. The temperature in the burning zone could exceed 800 degrees Celsius, enough to burn away protective paint, bend thin steel panels, and bury the entire area around the third car in thick black smoke. But Ukraine did not only want to set the train on fire, they wanted to create a secondary explosion. The third group continued targeting car number 12 in the middle of the train, where ammunition and military supplies were stored. By this point, smoke from the third car had blocked most of the view. The Beaver's camera could only catch streaks of light, the shadows of cargo cars, and the rails trembling beneath the train. The operator was no longer looking for a perfect frame. He relied on distance, the marked car number, and the direction of the railway line to hold the dive path. The Beaver cut through the edge of the smoke, then slammed directly into the body of car number 12. The fragmentation blast ripped open the metal skin, driving hot fragments into the storage compartment. Ammunition crates, propellant, and military supplies were thrown apart, creating a series of small ignition points. Scattered explosions began echoing, short and sharp, as part of the ammunition inside heated up. One side of car number 12 burst open, and flames began licking toward the neighboring cars. However, the major chain explosion had still not reached the rear of the train, and that was why the final group kept diving in. Their target was car number 18, deeper toward the rear, where the remaining military weapons cluster was trapped after the emergency braking. If this car was hit, the fire could pull the entire rear section of the train with it. One Beaver dropped even lower, skimming through the black smoke rolling up from car number 12. In the final seconds, the image almost disappeared completely, but the inertial system kept the aircraft on its dive path. Then, the shadow of car number 18 appeared between two streaks of fire. The Beaver drove straight into the body of the car. A larger explosion roared immediately afterward. Blast pressure and hot fragments punched into the cargo compartment, igniting new fire points inside the rear cars. This time, the flames ran along the rear section of the train, pulling one secondary explosion after another behind them. Steel doors were blown outward, red-hot metal fragments flew into the air, and the shockwave knocked several cargo cars off alignment with the rails. By 04:41 hours local time, the Russian supply train was almost completely disabled. The locomotive had been destroyed, the third car was burning violently, car number 12 had been ripped open, and car number 18 had triggered a chain of explosions spreading toward the rear of the train. Heavy rain was still pouring down, but it was not enough to put out fires being fed by fuel, flammable supplies, and ammunition inside. The railway line, once used to move fuel, weapons, and ammunition to the front, had now become a long strip of fire running through Luhansk. What remained was a blackened locomotive, deformed cargo cars, rails warped by heat, and a Russian logistics route stopped dead just before its supplies could reach the eastern battlefield. But the real value of this strike was not only in the destroyed train or the damaged railway bridge. Ukraine had just struck directly at one of the most sensitive weaknesses of the Russian army: its ability to maintain a continuous supply flow to the eastern front. The railway lines in Luhansk and Donetsk are logistical arteries carrying fuel, artillery shells, armored vehicles, repair components, and reinforcements from the rear to the front line. When one bridge is damaged and a weapons train is stopped directly on the railway, the damage does not end with a few burning cargo cars. It creates a chain effect across the entire operating rhythm of the Russian army in Donbas. First, Russia loses supply speed. A military train can carry far more fuel and ammunition than a truck convoy. When the railway line is cut, Moscow is forced to move part of the cargo by road, but truck transport is more expensive and even riskier. Second, this strike increases pressure on Russia's air defense network. If Ukraine can use long-range UAVs to strike bridges, rail lines, and trains inside occupied territory, Russia will have to allocate more Panzer, Tor, S-350, and electronic warfare systems to protect logistics infrastructure. Third, Ukraine is showing a clear shift in operational thinking. They are not only trying to destroy individual Russian units in the trenches, they are shifting toward wearing down the entire system that keeps those units alive. Railway bridges, fuel depots, ammunition trains, transport junctions, and supply routes are becoming priority targets. The political meaning of this strike is also significant. When logistics routes in Luhansk, Donetsk, and the connection points with Crimea are constantly under threat, Russia does not only face military damage, it also has to explain why rear areas once considered safe can now be hit so deeply and so accurately. This directly affects troop confidence, pressure on the command structure, and the image of battlefield control that Moscow wants to maintain. For Kyiv, this is a very clear message. Ukraine is not only defending and not only counterattacking on the front line, it is trying to isolate each Russian force grouping by striking the most important thing behind its supply. If ammunition arrives more slowly, fuel becomes scarcer, armored vehicles become harder to repair, and trains can no longer move safely, then Russian pressure on the eastern battlefield will gradually weaken over time. And that is why the strike on the railway bridge and supply train in Luhansk means far more than a morning explosion. It is part of a larger campaign to touch Russia's rear area into a zone that is no longer safe, stretch Russian air defenses, disrupt the transport system, and strengthen Ukraine's position at the negotiating table. If you found this attack impressive, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you do not miss the latest military analysis. And leave your comment below. Which logistics route do you think Ukraine should